smaller shed containing a panel with a confusion of wires sprouting from it. The village received no electricity from the government, so many villagers got their power from these makeshift hydroelectric projects. As the day went on and the sun climbed higher in the sky, more and more of the white mountain would be bathed in golden sun. Then as evening came, it fell in shadow as the sun moved up the black mountain. We timed our prayers by the shadow on the mountains. When the sun hit a certain rock, we used to say our ASR or afternoon prayers. Then in the evening, when the white peak of Spingar was even more beautiful than in the morning, we said the Maxim or evening prayers. You could see the white mountain from everywhere, and my father told me he used to think of it as a symbol of peace for our land, a white flag at the end of our valley. When he was a child, he thought this small valley was the entire world, and that if anyone went beyond the point where either mountain kissed the sky, they would fall off. Though I had been born in a city, I shared my father's love of nature. I loved the rich soil, the greenness of the plants, the crops, the buffaloes, and the yellow butterflies that fluttered about me as I walked. The village was very poor, but when we arrived our extended family would lay on a big feast. There would be bowls of chicken, rice, local spinach, and spicy mutton, all cooked over the fire by the women, followed by plates of crunchy apples, slices of yellow cake, and a big kettle of milky tea. None of the children had toys or books. The boys played cricket in a gully, and even the ball was made from plastic bags tied together with elastic bands. The village was a forgotten place. Water was carried from the spring. The few concrete houses had been built by families whose sons or fathers had gone south to work in the mines or to the Gulf, from where they sent money home. There are 40 million of us Pashtuns, of which 10 million live outside our homeland. My father said it was sad that they could never return, as they needed to keep working to maintain their family's new lifestyle. There were many families with no men. They would visit only once a year, and usually a new baby would arrive 9 months later. Scattered up and down the hills there were houses made of wattle and daub, like my grandfather's, and these often collapsed when there were floods. Children sometimes froze to death in winter. There was no hospital. Only Shopper had a clinic, and if anyone fell ill in the other villages they had to be carried there by their relatives on a wooden frame which we jokingly called the Shangla ambulance. If it was anything serious they would have to make the long bus journey to Mingora unless they were lucky enough to know someone with a car. Usually politicians only visited during election time, promising roads, electricity, clean water, and schools, and giving money and generators to influential local people we called stakeholders, who would instruct their communities on how to vote. Of course this only applied to the men. Women in our area don't vote. Then they disappeared off to Islamabad if they were elected to the National Assembly, or Peshawar for the Provincial Assembly, and we'd hear no more of them or their promises. My cousins made fun of me for my city ways. I did not like going barefoot. I read books and I had a different accent and used slang expressions from Mingora. My clothes were often from shops and not homemade like theirs. My relatives would ask me, "Would you like to cook chicken for us?" And I'd say, "No, the chicken is innocent. We should not kill her." They thought I was modern because I came from town. They did not realize people from Islamabad or even Peshawar would think me very backward. Sometimes we went up to the mountains and sometimes down to the river on family trips. It was a big stream, too deep and fast to cross when the snows melted in summer. The boys would fish using earthworms threaded like beads on a string hanging from a long stick. Some of them whistled, believing this would attract the fish. They weren't particularly tasty fish. Their mouths were very rough and horny. We called them shakwarti. Sometimes a group of girls would go down to the river for a picnic with pots of rice and sherbet. Our favorite game was weddings. We would get into 2 groups, each supposed to be a family, then each family would have to betroth a girl so we could perform a marriage ceremony. Everyone wanted me in their family as I was from Mingora and modern. The most beautiful girl was Tanzila, and we often gave her to the other group so we could then have her as our bride. The most important part of the mock wedding was jewelry. We took earrings, bangles, and necklaces to decorate the bride, singing Bollywood songs as we worked. Then we would put makeup on her face that we'd taken from our mothers, dip her hands in hot limestone and soda to make them white, and paint her nails red with henna. Once she was ready, the bride would start crying and we would stroke her hair and try to convince her not to worry. Marriage is part of life, we said. Be kind to your mother-in-law and father-in-law so they treat you well. Take care of your husband and be happy. Occasionally there would be real weddings with big feasts which went on for days and left the family bankrupt or in debt. The brides would wear exquisite clothes and be draped in gold, necklaces, and bangles given by both sides of the family. I read that Benazir Bhutto insisted on wearing glass bangles at her wedding to set an example, but the tradition of adorning the bride still continued. Sometimes a plywood coffin would be brought back from one of the mines. The women would gather at the house of the dead man's wife or mother and a terrible wailing would start and echo round the valley, which made my skin crawl. At night the village was very dark with just oil lamps twinkling in houses on the hills. None of the older women had any education, but they all told stories and recited what we call tapi, Pashto couplets. My grandmother was particularly good at them. They were usually about love or being a Pashtun. No Pashtun leaves his land of his own sweet will, she would say. Either he leaves from poverty or he leaves for love. Our aunts scared us with ghost stories, like the one about Shalgwate, the 20-fingered man, who they warned would sleep in our beds. We would cry in terror, though in fact as toe and finger in Pashto is the same, we were all 20-fingered, but we didn't realize. To make us wash, our aunts told stories about a scary woman called Shashaka, who would come after you with her muddy hands and stinking breath if you didn't take a bath or wash your hair, and turn you into a dirty woman with hair like rats' tails filled with insects. She might even kill you. In the winter, when parents didn't want their children to stay outside in the snow, they would tell the story about the lion or tiger which must always make the first step in the snow. Only when the lion or tiger has left their footprint were we allowed to go outside. As we got older, the village began to seem boring. The only television was in the hajara of one of the wealthier families, and no one had a computer. Women in the village hid their faces whenever they left their purdah quarters and could not meet or speak to men who were not their close relatives. I wore more fashionable clothes and didn't cover my face even when I became a teenager. One of my male cousins was angry and asked my father, "Why isn't she covered?" He replied, "She's my daughter. Look after your own affairs." But some of the family thought people would gossip about us and say we were not properly following Pashtunwali. I am very proud to be a Pashtun, but sometimes I think our code of conduct has a lot to answer for, particularly where the treatment of women is concerned. A woman named Shahida, who worked for us and had 3 small daughters, told me that when she was only 10 years old her father had sold her to an old man who already had a wife but wanted a younger one. When girls disappeared, it was not always because they had been married off. There was a beautiful 15-year-old girl called Seema. Everyone knew she was in love with a boy, and sometimes he would pass by and she would look at him from under her long dark lashes, which all the girls envied. In our society, for a girl to flirt with any man brings shame on the family, though it's all right for the man. We were told she had committed suicide, but we later discovered her own family had poisoned her. We have a custom called swara, by which a girl can be given to another tribe to resolve a feud. It is officially banned but still continues. In our village there was a widow called Saraya who married a widower from another clan which had a feud with her family. Nobody can marry a widow without the permission of her family. When Saraya's family found out about the union, they were furious. They threatened the widower's family until a jirga was called of village elders to resolve the dispute. The jirga decided that the widower's family should be punished by handing over their most beautiful girl to be married to the least eligible man of the rival clan. The boy was a good-for-nothing, so poor that the girl's father had to pay all their expenses. Why should a girl's life be ruined to settle a dispute she had nothing to do with? When I complained about these things to my father, he told me that life was harder for women in Afghanistan. The year before I was born, a group called the Taliban, led by a one-eyed mullah, had taken over the country and was burning girls' schools. They were forcing men to grow beards as long as a lantern and women to wear burqas. Wearing a burqa is like walking inside big fabric shuttlecock with only a grill to see through, and on hot days it's like an oven. At least I didn't have to wear one. He said that the Taliban had even banned women from laughing out loud or wearing white shoes, as white was a color that belonged to men. Women were being locked up and beaten just for wearing nail varnish. I shivered when he told me such things. I read my books like Anna Karenina and the novels of Jane Austen and trusted in my father's words, Malala is free as a bird. When I heard stories of the atrocities in Afghanistan, I felt proud to be in SWAT. Here a girl can go to school, I used to say. But the Taliban were just around the corner and were Pashtuns like us. For me the valley was a sunny place and I couldn't see the clouds gathering behind the mountains. My father used to say, I will protect your freedom, Malala. Carry on with your dreams. 5. Why I don't wear earrings and Pashtuns don't say thank you. By the age of 7 I was used to being top of my class. I was the one who would help other pupils who had difficulties. Malala is a genius girl, my class fellows would say. I was also known for participating in everything: badminton, drama, cricket, art, even singing, though I wasn't much good. So when a new girl named Malka Noor joined our class, I didn't think anything of it. Her name means Queen of Light, and she said she wanted to be Pakistan's first female army chief. Her mother was a teacher at a different school, which was unusual as none of our mothers worked. To begin with, she didn't say much in class. The competition was always between me and my best friend Maniba, who had beautiful writing and presentation, which the examiners liked, but I knew I could beat her on content. So when we did the end-of-year exams and Malka Noor came first, I was shocked. At home I cried and had to be comforted by my mother. Around that time we moved away from where we had been living on the same street as Maniba to an area where I didn't have any friends. On our new road there was a girl called Safina, who was a bit younger than me, and we started to play together. She was a pampered girl who had lots of dolls and a shoebox full of jewelry. But she kept eyeing up the pink plastic pretend mobile phone my father had bought me, which was one of the only toys I had. My father was always talking on his mobile, so I loved to copy him and pretend to make calls on mine. One day it disappeared. A few days later I saw Safina playing with a phone exactly the same as mine. "Where did you get that?" I asked. "I bought it in the bazaar," she said. I realize now she could have been telling the truth, but back then I thought, she is doing this to me and I will do the same to her. I used to go to her house to study, so whenever I was there I would pocket her things, mostly toy jewelry like earrings and necklaces. It was easy. At first stealing gave me a thrill, but that did not last long. Soon it became a compulsion. I did not know how to stop. One afternoon I came home from school and rushed into the kitchen as usual for a snack. "Hello, bye-bye," I called. "I'm starving." There was silence. My mother was sitting on the floor pounding spices, brightly colored turmeric and cumin, filling the air with their aroma. Over and over she pounded. Her eyes would not meet mine. What had I done? I was very sad and went to my room. When I opened my cupboard, I saw that all the things I had taken were gone. I had been caught. My cousin Rena came into my room. "They knew you were stealing," she said. "They were waiting for you to come clean, but you just kept on." I felt a terrible sinking feeling in my stomach. I walked back to my mother with my head bowed. "What you did was wrong, Malala," she said. "Are you trying to bring shame on us that we can't afford to buy such things?" "It's not true." I lied. "I didn't take them." But she knew I had. "Safina started it," I protested. "She took the pink phone that Abba bought me." My mother was unmoved. "Safina is younger than you and you should have taught her better," she said. "You should have set an example." I started crying and apologized over and over again. "Don't tell Abba," I begged. I couldn't bear for him to be disappointed in me. It's horrible to feel unworthy in the eyes of your parents. It wasn't the first time. When I was little I went to the bazaar with my mother and spotted a pile of almonds on a cart. They looked so tasty that I couldn't resist grabbing a handful. My mother told me off and apologized to the cart owner. He was furious and would not be placated. We still had little money and my mother checked her purse to see what she had. "Can you sell them to me for 10 rupees?" she asked. "No," he replied. "Almonds are very costly." My mother was very upset and told my father. He immediately went and bought the whole lot from the man and put them in a glass dish. "Almonds are good," he said. "If you eat them with milk just before bed it makes you brainy." But I knew he didn't have much money and the almonds in the dish were a reminder of my guilt. I promised myself I'd never do such a thing again. And now I had. My mother took me to say sorry to Safina and her parents. It was very hard. Safina said nothing about my phone, which didn't seem fair, but I didn't mention it either. Though I felt bad, I was also relieved it was over. Since that day I have never lied or stolen. Not a single lie nor a single penny, not even the coins my father leaves around the house, which we're allowed to buy snacks with. I also stopped wearing jewelry because I asked myself, what are these baubles which tempt me? Why should I lose my character for a few metal trinkets? But I still feel guilty, and to this day I say sorry to God in my prayers. My mother and father tell each other everything, so Abba soon found out why I was so sad. I could see in his eyes that I had failed him. I wanted him to be proud of me, like he was when I was presented with the first in-year trophies at school. Or the day our kindergarten teacher Miss Ulfat told him I had written, "Only speak in Urdu," on the blackboard for my classmates at the start of an Urdu lesson so we would learn the language faster. My father consoled me by telling me about the mistakes great heroes made when they were children. He told me that Mahatma Gandhi said, "Freedom is not worth having if it does not include the freedom to make mistakes." At school we had read stories about Muhammad Ali Jinnah. As a boy in Karachi he would study by the glow of street lights because there was no light at home. He told other boys to stop playing marbles in the dust and to play cricket instead so their clothes and hands wouldn't get dirty. Outside his office my father had a framed copy of a letter written by Abraham Lincoln to his son's teacher, translated into Pashto. It is a very beautiful letter, full of good advice. Teach him, if you can, the wonder of books. But also give him quiet time to ponder the eternal mystery of birds in the sky, bees in the sun, and the flowers on a green hillside, it says. Teach him it is far more honorable to fail than to cheat. I think everyone makes a mistake at least once in their life. The important thing is what you learn from it. That's why I have problems with our Pashtunwali code. We are supposed to take revenge for wrongs done to us, but where does that end? If a man in one family is killed or hurt by another man, revenge must be exacted to restore Nang. It can be taken by killing any male member of the attacker's family. Then that family in turn must take revenge. And on it goes. There is no time limit. We have a saying, the Pashtun took revenge after 20 years and another said it was taken too soon. We are a people of many sayings. One is the stone of Pashto does not rust in water, which means we neither forget nor forgive. That's also why we rarely say thank you, Manana, because we believe a Pashtun will never forget a good deed and is bound to reciprocate at some point, just as he will a bad one. Kindness can only be repaid with kindness. It can't be repaid with expressions like thank you. Many families live in walled compounds with watchtowers so they can keep an eye out for their enemies. We knew many victims of feuds. One was Sher Zaman, a man who had been in my father's class and always got better grades than him. My grandfather and uncle used to drive my father mad, teasing him, "You're not as good as Sher Zaman," so much he once wished that rocks would come down the mountain and flatten him. But Sher Zaman did not go to college and ended up becoming a dispenser in the village pharmacy. His family became embroiled in a dispute with their cousins over a small plot of forest. One day, as Sher Zaman and 2 of his brothers were on their way to the land, they were ambushed by his uncle and some of his men. All 3 brothers were killed. As a respected man in the community, my father was often called on to mediate feuds. He did not believe in battle, revenge, and would try to make people see that neither side had anything to gain from continuing the violence, and it would be better for them to get on with their lives. There were 2 families in our village he could not convince. They had been locked in a feud for so long no one even seemed to remember how it had started, probably some small slight as we are a hot-headed people. First a brother on one side would attack an uncle on the other. Then vice versa. It consumed their lives. Our people say it is a good system, and our crime rate is much lower than in non-Pashtun areas. But I think that if someone kills your brother, you shouldn't kill them or their brother, you should teach them instead. I am inspired by Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, the man who some call the frontier Gandhi, who introduced a non-violent philosophy to our culture. It's the same with stealing. Some people, like me, get caught and vow they will never do it again. Others say, oh, it's no big deal, it was just a little thing. But the second time they will steal something bigger and the third something bigger still. In my country too many politicians think nothing of stealing. They are rich and we are a poor country yet they loot and loot. Most of them don't pay tax, but that's the least of it. They take out loans from state banks but they don't pay them back. They get kickbacks on government contracts from friends or the companies they award them to. Many of them own expensive flats in London. I don't know how they can live with their consciences when they see our people going hungry or sitting in the darkness of endless power cuts, or children unable to go to school as their parents need them to work. My father says that Pakistan has been cursed with more than its fair share of politicians who only think about money. They don't care if the army is actually flying the plane, they are happy to stay out of the cockpit and sit in business class, close the curtains and enjoy the fine food and service while the rest of us are squashed in economy. I had been born into a sort of democracy in which for 10 years Benazir Bhutto and Nawaz Sharif kept replacing each other, none of their governments ever completing a term and always accusing each other of corruption. But 2 years after I was born the generals again took over. It happened in a manner so dramatic that it sounds like something out of a movie. Nawaz Sharif was prime minister at the time and had fallen out with his army chief General Pervez Musharraf and sacked him. At the time General Musharraf was on a plane of our national airline PIA coming back from Sri Lanka. Nawaz Sharif was so worried about his reaction that he tried to stop the plane from landing in Pakistan. He ordered Karachi airport to switch off its landing lights and to park fire engines on the runway to block the plane even though it had 200 other passengers on board and not enough fuel to get to another country. Within an hour of the announcement on television of Musharraf's sacking, tanks were on the streets and troops had taken over the newsrooms and the airports. The local commander, General Iftikhar, stormed the control tower at Karachi so that Musharraf's plane could land. Musharraf then seized power and threw Sharif into a dungeon in Adak Fort. Some people celebrated by handing out sweets as Sharif was unpopular, but my father cried when he heard the news. He had thought we were done with military dictatorships. Sharif was accused of treason and only saved by his friends in the Saudi royal family, who arranged his exile. Musharraf was our 4th military ruler. Like all our dictators, he started by addressing the nation on TV, beginning, Mir Aziz Hamwatano, my dear countrymen, then went into a long tirade against Sharif, saying that under him Pakistan had lost our honor, dignity, and respect. He vowed to end corruption and go after those guilty of plundering and looting the national wealth. He promised he would make his own assets and tax return public. He said he would only run the country for a short time, but no one believed him. General Zia had promised to be in power for 90 days and had stayed more than 11 years until he was killed in an air crash. It's the same old story, my father said, and he was right. Musharraf promised to end the old feudal system by which the same few dozen families controlled our entire country, and bring fresh young clean faces into politics. Instead his cabinet was made up of the very same old faces. Once again our country was expelled from the Commonwealth and became an international black sheep. The Americans had already suspended most aid the year before when we conducted nuclear tests, but now almost everyone boycotted us. With such a history, you can see why the people of Swat did not always think it was a good idea to be part of Pakistan. Every few years Pakistan sent us a new deputy commissioner, or DC, to govern Swat, just as the British had done in colonial days. It seemed to us that these bureaucrats came to our province simply to get rich, then went back home. They had no interest in developing Swat. Our people are used to being subservient because under the Wali no criticism was tolerated. If anyone offended him, their entire family could be expelled from Swat. So when the DCS came from Pakistan, they were the new kings and no one questioned them. Older people often looked back nostalgically to the days of the last Wali. Back then, they said, the mountains were all still covered in trees, there were schools every 5 kilometers and the Wali Sahib would visit them in person to resolve problems. After what happened with Saifina, I vowed that I would never treat a friend badly again. My father always says it's important to treat friends well. When he was at college and had no money for food or books, many of his friends helped him out and he never forgot that. I have 3 good friends, Saifina from my area, Sambul from the village and Maniba from school. Maniba had become my best friend in primary school when we lived near each other, and I persuaded her to come to our school. She is a wise girl, though we often fall out, particularly when we go on school trips. She comes from a large family with 3 sisters and 4 brothers. I think of her as my big sister even though I am 6 months older than her. Maniba sets down rules which I try to follow. We don't have secrets from each other and we don't share our secrets with anyone else. She doesn't like me talking to other girls and says we must be careful of associating with people who are badly behaved or have a reputation for trouble. She always says, I have 4 brothers, and if I do even the slightest thing wrong they can stop me going to school. I was so eager not to disappoint my parents that I ran errands for anyone. One day our neighbors asked me to buy some maize for them from the bazaar. On the way a boy on a bicycle crashed into me and my left shoulder hurt so much that my eyes watered. But I still went and bought the maize, took it to my neighbors and then went home. Only then did I cry. Shortly after that I found the perfect way to try to win back the respect of my father. Notices had gone up at school for a public speaking competition and Maniba and I both decided to enter. I remembered the story of my father surprising my grandfather and longed to do the same. When we got the topic, I couldn't believe my eyes. It was honesty is the best policy. The only practice we'd had was reading out poems at morning assembly, but there was an older girl at school called Fatima who was a very good speaker. She was beautiful and spoke in an animated way. She could speak confidently in front of hundreds of people and they would hang on her every word. Maniba and I longed to be like her and studied her carefully. In our culture speeches are usually written by our fathers, uncles, or teachers. They tend to be in English or Urdu, not in our native Pashto. We thought speaking in English meant you were more intelligent. We were wrong, of course. It does not matter what language you choose, the important thing is the words you use to express yourself. Maniba's speech was written by one of her older brothers. She quoted beautiful poems by Allama Iqbal, our national poet. My father wrote my speech. In it he argued that if you want to do good, but do it in a bad way, that's still bad. In the same way, if you choose a good method to do something bad it's still bad. He ended it with Lincoln's words, it is far more honorable to fail than to cheat. On the day only 8 or 9 boys and girls turned up. Maniba spoke well. She was very composed and her speech was more emotional and poetic than mine, though mine might have had the better message. I was so nervous before the speech, I was trembling with fear. My grandfather had come to watch and I knew he really wanted me to win the competition, which made me even more nervous. I remembered what my father had said about taking a deep breath before starting, but then I saw that all eyes were on me and I rushed through. I kept losing my place as the pages danced in my shaking hands, but as I ended with Lincoln's words, I looked up at my father. He was smiling. When the judges announced the results at the end, Maniba had won. I came second. It didn't matter. Lincoln also wrote in the letter to his son's teacher, "Teach him how to gracefully lose." I was used to coming top of my class. But I realized that, even if you win 3 or 4 times, the next victory will not necessarily be yours without trying, and also that sometimes it's better to tell your own story. I started writing my own speeches and changing the way I delivered them, from my heart rather than from a sheet of paper. 6 children of the Rubbish Mountain. As the Kushal school started to attract more pupils, we moved again and finally had a television. My favorite program was Shaka Laka Boom Boom, an Indian children's series about a boy called Sanju who has a magic pencil. Everything he drew became real. If he drew a vegetable or a policeman, the vegetable or policeman would magically appear. If he accidentally drew a snake, he could erase it and the snake would disappear. He used his pencil to help people, he even saved his parents from gangsters, and I wanted that magic pencil more than anything else in the world. At night I would pray, "God, give me Sanju's pencil. I won't tell anyone. Just leave it in my cupboard. I will use it to make everyone happy." As soon as I finished praying, I would check the drawer. The pencil was never there, but I knew who I would help first. Just along the street from our new house was an abandoned strip of land that people used as a rubbish dump. There is no rubbish collection in Swat. Quickly, it became a rubbish mountain. I didn't like walking near it as it smelled so bad. Sometimes we would spot rats running through it and crows would circle overhead. One day my brothers were not home and my mother had asked me to throw away some potato peel and eggshells. I wrinkled my nose as I approached, swatting away flies and making sure I didn't step on anything in my nice shoes. As I threw the rubbish on the mountain of rotting food, I saw something move and I jumped. It was a girl about my age. Her hair was matted and her skin was covered in sores. She looked like I imagined Shashaka, the dirty woman they told us about in tales in the village to make us wash. The girl had a big sack and was sorting rubbish into piles, one for cans, one for bottle tops, another for glass and another for paper. Nearby there were boys fishing in the pile for metal using magnets on strings. I wanted to talk to the children but I was too scared. That afternoon, when my father came home from school, I told him about the scavenger children and begged him to go with me to look. He tried to talk to them but they ran away. He explained that the children would sell what they had sorted to a garbage shop for a few rupees. The shop would then sell it on at a profit. On the way back home I noticed that he was in tears. "Abba, you must give them free places at your school," I begged. He laughed. My mother and I had already persuaded him to give free places to a number of girls. Though my mother was not educated, she was the practical one in the family, the doer, while my father was the talker. She was always out helping people. My father would get angry sometimes. He would arrive home at lunchtime and call out, "Tor Pikai, I'm home," only to find she was out and there was no lunch for him. Then he would find she was at the hospital visiting someone who was ill, or had gone to help a family, so he could not stay cross. Sometimes though she would be out because she was shopping for clothes in the China bazaar, and that would be a different matter. Wherever we lived my mother filled our house with people. I shared my room with my cousin Annie Essa from the village, who had come to live with us so she could go to school, and a girl called Shanice whose mother Sultana had once worked in our house. Shanice and her sister had also been sent out to collect garbage after their father had died, leaving them very poor. One of her brothers was mentally ill and was always doing strange things like setting fire to their clothes or selling the electric fan we gave them to keep cool. Sultana was very short-tempered and my mother did not like having her in the house, but my father arranged a small allowance for her and a place for Shanice and her other brother at his school. Shanice had never been to school, so even though she was 2 years older than me, she was put 2 classes below, and she came to live with us so that I could help her. There was also Noria, whose mother Kuru did some of our washing and cleaning, and Alishba, one of the daughters of Khalida, the woman who helped my mother with the cooking. Khalida had been sold into marriage to an old man who used to beat her, and eventually she ran away with her 3 daughters. Her own family would not take her back because it is believed that a woman who has left her husband has brought shame on her family. For a while her daughters also had to collect rubbish to survive. Her story was like something out of the novels I had started reading. The school had expanded a lot by then and had 3 buildings. The original one in Landikas was a primary school, and then there was a high school for girls on Yaya Street and one for boys with a big garden of roses near the remains of the Buddhist temple. We had about 800 students in total, and although the school was not really making money, my father gave away more than 100 free places. One of them was to a boy whose father, Sharafat Ali, had helped my father when he was a penniless college student. They were friends from the village. Sharafat Ali worked at the electricity company and he would give my father a few hundred rupees whenever he could spare them. My father was happy to be able to repay his kindness. Another was a girl in my class called Kazar, whose father embroidered clothes and shawls, a trade our region is famous for. When we went on school trips to visit the mountains, I knew she couldn't afford them, so I would pay for her with my pocket money. Giving places to poor children didn't just mean my father lost their fees. Some of the richer parents took their children out of the school when they realized they were sharing classrooms with the sons and daughters of people who cleaned their houses or stitched their clothes. They thought it was shameful for their children to mix with those from poor families. My mother said it was hard for the poor children to learn when they were not getting enough food at home, so some of the girls would come to our house for breakfast. My father joked that our home had become a boarding house. Having so many people around made it hard to study. I had been delighted to have my own room, and my father had even bought me a dressing table to work on. But now I had 2 other girls in the room. I want space. I'd cry. But then I felt guilty as I knew we were lucky. I thought back to the children working on the rubbish heap. I kept seeing the dirty face of the girl from the dump and continued to pester my father to give them places at our school. He tried to explain that those children were breadwinners, so if they went to school, even for free, the whole family would go hungry. However, he got a wealthy philanthropist, Azadeh Khan, to pay for him to produce a leaflet asking, Kia hasul elam in bashun ka hak nahe? Is education not the right of these children? My father printed thousands of these leaflets, left them at local meetings and distributed them around town. By then my father was becoming a well-known figure in Swat. Even though he was not a Khan or a rich man, people listened to him. They knew he would have something interesting to say at workshops and seminars and wasn't afraid to criticize the authorities, even the army, which was now running our country. He was becoming known to the army too, and friends told him that the local commander had called him lethal in public. My father didn't know what exactly the brigadier meant, but in our country, where the army is so powerful, it did not bode well. One of his pet hates was the ghost schools. Influential people in remote areas took money from the government for schools which never saw a single pupil. Instead they used the buildings for their hajaras or even to keep their animals. There was even a case of a man drawing a teacher's pension when he had never taught a day in his life. Aside from corruption and bad government, my father's main concern in those days was the environment. Mingora was expanding quickly, around 175,000 people now called it home, and our once fresh air was becoming very polluted from all the vehicles and cooking fires. The beautiful trees on our hills and mountains were being chopped down for timber. My father said only around half the town's population had access to safe drinking water and most, like us, had no sanitation. So he and his friends set up something called the Global Peace Council, which, despite its name, had very local concerns. The name was ironic and my father often laughed about it, but the organization's aim was serious, to preserve the environment of Swat and promote peace and education among local people. My father also loved to write poetry, sometimes about love, but often on controversial themes such as honor killings and women's rights. Once he visited Afghanistan for a poetry festival at the Kabul Intercontinental Hotel, where he read a poem about peace. It was mentioned as the most inspiring in the closing speech, and some in the audience asked him to repeat whole stanzas and couplets, exclaiming wah wah when a particular line pleased them, which is a bit like bravo. Even my grandfather was proud. "Son, may you be the star in the sky of knowledge," he used to say. We too were proud, but his higher profile meant we didn't see him very much. It was always our mother who shopped for our clothes and took us to hospital if we were ill, even though in our culture, particularly for those of us from villages, a woman is not supposed to do these things alone. So one of my father's nephews would have to go along. When my father was at home, he and his friends sat on the roof at dusk and talked politics endlessly. There was really only one subject, 9/11. It might have changed the whole world, but we were living right in the epicentre of everything. Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, had been living in Kandahar when the attack on the World Trade Center happened, and the Americans had sent thousands of troops to Afghanistan to catch him and overthrow the Taliban regime which had protected him. In Pakistan we were still under a dictatorship, but America needed our help, just as it had in the 1980s to fight the Russians in Afghanistan. Just as the Russian invasion of Afghanistan had changed everything for General Zia, so 9/11 transformed General Musharraf from an international outcast. Suddenly he was being invited to the White House by George W. Bush and to 10 Downing Street by Tony Blair. There was a major problem, however. Our own intelligence service, ISI, had virtually created the Taliban. Many ISI officers were close to its leaders, having known them for years, and shared some of their beliefs. The ISI's Colonel Imam boasted he had trained 90,000 Taliban fighters and even became Pakistan's consul general in Herat during the Taliban regime. We were not fans of the Taliban as we had heard they destroyed girls' schools and blew up giant Buddha statues. We had many Buddhas of our own that we were proud of. But many Pashtuns did not like the bombing of Afghanistan or the way Pakistan was helping the Americans, even if it was only by allowing them to cross our airspace and stopping weapons supplies to the Taliban. We did not know then that Musharraf was also letting the Americans use our airfields. Some of our religious people saw Osama bin Laden as a hero. In the bazaar you could buy posters of him on a white horse and boxes of sweets with his picture on them. These clerics said 9/11 was revenge on the Americans for what they had been doing to other people round the world, but they ignored the fact that the people in the World Trade Center were innocent and had nothing to do with American policy, and that the Holy Quran clearly says it is wrong to kill. Our people see conspiracies behind everything, and many argued that the attack was actually carried out by Jews as an excuse for America to launch a war on the Muslim world. Some of our newspapers printed stories that no Jews went to work at the World Trade Center that day. My father said this was rubbish. Musharraf told our people that he had no choice but to cooperate with the Americans. He said they had told him, either you are with us, or you are with the terrorists, and threatened to bomb us back to the Stone Age if we stood against them. But we weren't exactly cooperating, as the ISI was still arming Taliban fighters and giving their leaders sanctuary in Quetta. They even persuaded the Americans to let them fly hundreds of Pakistani fighters out of northern Afghanistan. The ISI chief asked the Americans to hold off their attack on Afghanistan until he had gone to Kandahar to ask the Taliban leader Mullah Omar to hand over bin Laden. Instead he offered the Taliban help. In our province, Maulana Sufi Muhammad, who had fought in Afghanistan against the Russians, issued a fatwa against the US. He held a big meeting in Malakand, where our ancestors had fought the British. The Pakistani government didn't stop him. The governor of our province issued a statement that anyone who wanted to fight in Afghanistan against NATO forces was free to do so. Some 12,000 young men from Swat went to help the Taliban. Many never came back. They were most likely killed, but as there is no proof of death, their wives can't be declared widows. It's very hard on them. My father's close friend Wahid Zaman's brother and brother-in-law were among the many who went to Afghanistan. Their wives and children are still waiting for them. I remember visiting them and feeling their longing. Even so, it all seemed far, far away from our peaceful garden valley. Afghanistan is less than 100 miles away, but to get there you have to go through Bajor, one of the tribal areas between Pakistan and the border with Afghanistan. Bin Laden and his men fled to the White Mountains of Tora Bora in eastern Afghanistan, where he had built a network of tunnels while fighting the Russians. They escaped through these and over the mountains into Kurram, another tribal agency. What we didn't know then was that Bin Laden came to Swat and stayed in a remote village for a year, taking advantage of the Pashtunwali hospitality code. Anyone could see that Musharraf was double-dealing, taking American money while still helping the jihadis, strategic assets, as the ISI calls them. The Americans say they gave Pakistan billions of dollars to help their campaign against Al-Qaeda, but we didn't see a single cent. Musharraf built a mansion by Rabo Lake in Islamabad and bought an apartment in London. Every so often an important American official would complain that we weren't doing enough, and then suddenly some big fish would be caught. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11, was found in a house just a mile from the Army Chief's official residence in Rawalpindi. But President Bush kept praising Musharraf, inviting him to Washington and calling him his buddy. My father and his friends were disgusted. They said the Americans always preferred dealing with dictators in Pakistan. From an early age I was interested in politics and sat on my father's knee listening to everything he and his friends discussed. But I was more concerned with matters closer to home, our own street to be exact. I told my friends at school about the rubbish dump children and that we should help. Not everyone wanted to, as they said the children were dirty and probably diseased, and their parents would not like them going to school with children like that. They also said it wasn't up to us to sort out the problem. I didn't agree. We can sit by and hope the government will help, but they won't. If I can help support one or two children and another family supports one or two, then between us we can help them all. I knew it was pointless appealing to Musharraf. In my experience, if my father couldn't help with matters like these, there was only one option. I wrote a letter to God. Dear God, I wrote, I know you see everything, but there are so many things that maybe, sometimes, things get missed, particularly now with the bombing in Afghanistan. But I don't think you would be happy if you saw the children on my road living on a rubbish dump. God, give me strength and courage and make me perfect, because I want to make this world perfect. Malala. The problem was I did not know how to get it to him. Somehow I thought it needed to go deep into the earth, so first I buried it in the garden. Then I thought it would get spoiled, so I put it in a plastic bag. But that didn't seem much use. We like to put sacred texts in flowing waters, so I rolled it up, tied it to a piece of wood, placed a dandelion on top and floated it in the stream which flows into the Swat River. Surely God would find it there. 7. The Mufti who tried to close our school just in front of the school on Kushal Street, where I was born, was the house of a tall handsome mullah and his family. His name was Ghulamullah and he called himself a Mufti, which means he is an Islamic scholar and authority on Islamic law, though my father complains that anyone with a turban can call themselves a Maulana or Mufti. The school was doing well, and my father was building an impressive reception with an arched entrance in the boys' high school. For the first time my mother could buy nice clothes and even send out for food, as she had dreamed of doing back in the village. But all this time the Mufti was watching. He watched the girls going in and out of our school every day and became angry, particularly as some of the girls were teenagers. That Maulana has a bad eye on us, said my father one day. He was right. Shortly afterwards the Mufti went to the woman who owned the school premises and said, Jiyauddin is running a harem school in your building and bringing shame on the Mohalla neighborhood. These girls should be in Purdah. He told her, take this building back from him and I will rent it for my madrasa. If you do this you will get paid now and also receive a reward in the next world. She refused and her son came to my father in secret. This MALALA is starting a campaign against you, he warned. We won't give him the building but be careful. My father was angry. Just as we say, Nim Hakim Katre Jan, half a doctor is a danger to one's life, so, Nim Mullah Katre Iman, a mullah who is not fully learned is a danger to faith, he said. I am proud that our country was created as the world's first Muslim homeland, but we still don't agree on what this means. The Quran teaches us sabr, patience, but often it feels that we have forgotten the word and think Islam means women sitting at home in purdah or wearing burqas while men do jihad. We have many strands of Islam in Pakistan. Our founder Jinnah wanted the rights of Muslims in India to be recognized, but the majority of people in India were Hindu. It was as if there was a feud between two brothers and they agreed to live in different houses. So British India was divided in August 1947, and an independent Muslim state was born. It could hardly have been a bloodier beginning. Millions of Muslims crossed from India, and Hindus traveled in the other direction. Almost 2 million of them were killed trying to cross the new border. Many were slaughtered on trains which arrived at Lahore and Delhi full of bloodied corpses. My own grandfather narrowly escaped death in the riots when his train was attacked by Hindus on his way home from Delhi, where he had been studying. Now we are a country of 180 million and more than 96% are Muslim. We also have around 2 million Christians and more than 2 million Ahmadis, who say they are Muslims though our government says they are not. Sadly, those minority communities are often attacked. Jinnah had lived in London as a young man and trained as a barrister. He wanted a land of tolerance. Our people often quote the famous speech he made a few days before independence: you are free to go to your temples, you are free to go to your mosques or to any other place of worship in the state of Pakistan. You may belong to any religion or caste or creed, that has nothing to do with the business of the state. My father says the problem is that Jinnah negotiated a piece of real estate for us but not a state. He died of tuberculosis just a year after the creation of Pakistan and we haven't stopped fighting since. We have had 3 wars against India and what seems like endless killing inside our own country. We Muslims are split between Sunnis and Shias. We share the same fundamental beliefs and the same holy Quran, but we disagree over who was the right person to lead our religion when the Prophet died in the 7th century. The man chosen to be the leader or caliph was Abu Bakr, a close friend and advisor of the Prophet and the man he chose to lead prayers as he lay on his deathbed. Sunni comes from the Arabic for one who follows the traditions of the Prophet. But a smaller group believed that leadership should have stayed within the Prophet's family and that Ali, his son-in-law and cousin, should have taken over. They became known as Shias, shortened from Shia Ali, the party of Ali. Every year Shias commemorate the killing of the Prophet's grandson Hussein ibn Ali at the Battle of Karbala in the year 680 with a festival called Muharram. They whip themselves into a bloody frenzy with metal chains or razor blades on strings until the streets run red. One of my father's friends is a Shia and he cries whenever he talks about Hussein's death at Karbala. He gets so emotional you would think the events had happened just the night before, not more than 1,300 years ago. Our own founder, Jinnah, was a Shia, and Benazir Bhutto's mother was also a Shia from Iran. Most Pakistanis are Sunnis like us, more than 80%, but within that we are again many groups. By far the biggest group is the Barelvis, who are named after a 19th century madrasa in Bareilly, which lies in the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh. Then we have the Deobandi, named after another famous 19th century madrasa in Uttar Pradesh, this time in the village of Deoband. They are very conservative and most of our madrasas are Deobandi. We also have the Ali Hadith, people of the Hadith, who are Salafists. This group is more Arab-influenced and even more conservative than the others. They are what the West calls fundamentalists. They don't accept our saints and shrines. Many Pakistanis are also mystical people and gather at Sufi shrines to dance and worship. Each of these strands has many different subgroups. The Mufti on Kushal Street was a member of Tabligh-e-Jamaat, a Deobandi group that holds a huge rally every year at its headquarters in Rawalpindi, near Lahore, attended by millions of people. Our last dictator General Zia used to go there, and in the 1980s, under his regime, the Tablighis became very powerful. Many of the imams appointed to preach in army barracks were Tablighis, and army officers would often take leave and go on preaching tours for the group. One night, after the Mufti had failed to persuade our landlady to cancel our lease, he gathered some of the influential people and elders of our mohalla into a delegation and turned up at our door. There were 7 people, some other senior Tablighis, a mosque keeper, a former jihadi and a shopkeeper, and they filled our small house. My father seemed worried and shooed us into the other room, but the house was small so we could hear every word. I am representing the ulama and Tablighian and Taliban, Mullah Ghulamullah said, referring to not just one but 2 organizations of Muslim scholars to give himself gravitas. I am representing good Muslims and we all think your girls' school is haram and a blasphemy. You should close it. Girls should not be going to school, he continued. A girl is so sacred she should be in purdah, and so private that there is no lady's name in the Quran as God doesn't want her to be named. My father could listen no more. Maryam is mentioned everywhere in the Quran. Was she not a woman and a good woman at that? No, said the mullah. She is only there to prove that Isa Jesus was the son of Maryam, not the son of God. That may be, replied my father. But I am pointing out that the Quran names Maryam. The Mufti started to object but my father had had enough. Turning to the group, he said, when this gentleman passes me on the street, I look to him and greet him but he doesn't answer, he just bows his head. The mullah looked down embarrassed because greeting someone properly is important in Islam. You run the haram school, he said. That's why I don't want to greet you. Then one of the other men spoke up. I'd heard you were an infidel, he said to my father, but there are Qurans in your room. Of course there are, replied my father, astonished that his faith would be questioned. I am a Muslim. Let's get back to the subject of the school, said the Mufti, who could see the discussion was not going his way. There are men in the reception area of the school, and they see the girls enter, and this is very bad. I have a solution, said my father. The school has another gate. The girls will enter through that. The mullah clearly wasn't happy as he wanted the school closed altogether. But the elders were happy with this compromise and they left. My father suspected this would not be the end of the matter. What we knew and they didn't was that the Mufti's own niece attended the school in secret. So a few days later my father called the Mufti's elder brother, the girl's father. I am very tired of your brother, he said. What kind of mullah is he? He's driving us crazy. Can you help to get him off our backs? I'm afraid I can't help you, Jiyauddin, he replied. I have trouble in my home too. He lives with us and has told his wife that she must observe purdah from us and that our wives must observe purdah from him, all in this small space. Our wives are like sisters to him and his is like a sister to us, but this madman has made our house a hell. I am sorry but I can't help you. My father was right to think this man was not going to give up. Mullahs had become more powerful figures since Zia's rule and campaign of Islamization. In some ways General Musharraf was very different from General Zia. Though he usually dressed in uniform, he occasionally wore Western suits and he called himself chief executive instead of chief martial law administrator. He also kept dogs, which we Muslims regard as unclean. Instead of Zia's Islamization he began what he called enlightened moderation. He opened up our media, allowing new private TV channels and female news readers, as well as showing dancing on television. The celebration of Western holidays such as Valentine's Day and New Year's Eve was allowed. He even sanctioned an annual pop concert on the eve of Independence Day, which was broadcast to the nation. He did something which our democratic rulers hadn't, even Benazir, and abolished the law that for a woman to prove she was raped, she had to produce 4 male witnesses. He appointed the first woman governor of the state bank and the first women airline pilots and coast guards. He even announced we would have female guards at Jinnah's tomb in Karachi. However, in our Pashtun homeland of the northwest frontier province things were very different. In 2002 Musharraf held elections for controlled democracy. They were strange elections as the main party leaders Nawaz Sharif and Benazir Bhutto were in exile. In our province these elections brought what we called a mullah government to power. The Muttahida Majlis-e-Amal, MMA, alliance was a group of 5 religious parties including the Jamiat Ulama-e-Islam, CHWI, which ran the madrasas where the Taliban were trained. People jokingly referred to the MMA as the Mullah Military Alliance and said they got elected because they had Musharraf's support. But some people supported them because the very religious Pashtuns were angry at the American invasion of Afghanistan and the removal of the Taliban from power there. Our area had always been more conservative than most of the rest of Pakistan. During the Afghan Jihad many madrasas had been built, most of them funded by Saudi money, and many young men had passed through them as it was free education. That was the start of what my father calls the Arabization of Pakistan. Then 9/11 had made this militancy more mainstream. Sometimes when I walked along the main road I saw chalked messages on the sides of buildings. Contact US for jihad training, they would say, listing a phone number to call. In those days jihadi groups were free to do whatever they wanted. You could see them openly collecting contributions and recruiting men. There was even a headmaster from Shangla who would boast that his greatest success was to send 10 boys in grade 9 for jihad training in Kashmir. The MMA government banned CD and DVD shops and wanted to create a morality police like the Afghan Taliban had set up. The idea was they would be able to stop a woman accompanied by a man and require her to prove that the man was her relative. Thankfully, our Supreme Court stopped this. Then MMA activists launched attacks on cinemas and tore down billboards with pictures of women or blacked them out with paint. They even snatched female mannequins from clothing shops. They harassed men wearing Western-style shirts and trousers instead of the traditional shalwar kameez and insisted women cover their heads. It was as though they wanted to remove all traces of womankind from public life. My father's high school opened in 2003. That first year they had boys and girls together, but by 2004 the climate had changed so it was unthinkable to have girls and boys in the same class. That changing climate made Ghulamullah bold. One of the school clerks told my father that the mufti kept coming into school and demanding why we girls were still using the main entrance. He said that one day, when a male member of staff took a female teacher out to the main road to get a rickshaw, the Maulana asked, "Why did this man escort her to the road? Is he her brother?" "No," replied the clerk, "he is a colleague." "That is wrong," said the Maulana. My father told the clerk to call him next time he saw the Maulana. When the call came, my father and the Islamic studies teacher went out to confront him. "Maulana, you have driven me to the wall," my father said. "Who are you? You are crazy. You need to go to a doctor. You think I enter the school and take my clothes off? When you see a boy and a girl you see a scandal. They are school children. I think you should go and see Dr. Haider Ali." Dr. Haider Ali was a well-known psychiatrist in our area, so to say, "Shall we take you to Dr. Haider Ali?" meant "Are you mad?" The mufti went quiet. He took off his turban and put it in my father's lap. For us a turban is a public symbol of chivalry and Pashtunness, and for a man to lose his turban is considered a great humiliation. But then he started up again. "I never said those things to your clerk. He is lying." My father had had enough. "You have no business here," he shouted. "Go away." The mufti had failed to close our school, but his interference was an indication of how our country was changing. My father was worried. He and his fellow activists were holding endless meetings. These were no longer just about stopping people cutting down trees but were also about education and democracy. In 2004, after resisting pressure from Washington for more than 2.5 years, General Musharraf sent the army into the federally administered tribal areas, FATA, 7 agencies that lie along the border with Afghanistan, where the government had little control. The Americans claimed that al-Qaeda militants who had fled from Afghanistan during the U.S. bombing were using the areas as a safe haven, taking advantage of our Pashtun hospitality. From there they were running training camps and launching raids across the border on NATO troops. For us in SWAT this was very close to home. One of the agencies, Bajor, is next to SWAT. The people who live in the FATA are all from Pashtun tribes like us Yusufzai, and live on both sides of the border with Afghanistan. The tribal agencies were created in British times as a buffer zone between Afghanistan and what was then India, and they are still run in the same way, administered by tribal chiefs or elders known as Maliks. Unfortunately, the Maliks make little difference. In truth, the tribal areas are not governed at all. They are forgotten places of harsh rocky valleys where people scrape by on smuggling. The average annual income is just $250, half the Pakistani average. They have very few hospitals and schools, particularly for girls, and political parties were not allowed there until recently. Hardly any women from these areas can read. The people are renowned for their fierceness and independence, as you can see if you read any of the old British accounts. Our army had never before gone into the FATA. Instead they had maintained indirect control in the same way the British had, relying on the Pashtun recruited frontier corps rather than regular soldiers. Sending in the regular army was a tough decision. Not only did our army and ISI have long links with some of the militants, but it also meant our troops would be fighting their own Pashtun brothers. The first tribal area that the army entered was South Waziristan, in March 2004. Predictably, the local people saw it as an attack on their way of life. All the men there carry weapons and hundreds of soldiers were killed when the locals revolted. The army was in shock. Some men refused to fight, not wishing to battle their own people. They retreated after just 12 days and reached what they called a negotiated peace settlement with local militant leaders like Nek Mohammed. This involved the army bribing them to halt all attacks and keep out foreign fighters. The militants simply used the cash to buy more weapons and resumed their activities. A few months later came the first attack on Pakistan by a U.S. drone. On June 17, 2004, an unmanned Predator dropped a Hellfire missile on Nek Mohammed in South Waziristan, apparently while he was giving an interview by satellite phone. He and the men around him were killed instantly. Local people had no idea what it was. Back then we did not know that the Americans could do such a thing. Whatever you thought about Nek Mohammed, we were not at war with the Americans and were shocked that they would launch attacks from the sky on our soil. Across the tribal areas people were angry and many joined militant groups or formed Lashkars, local militias. Then there were more attacks. The Americans said that bin Laden's deputy Ayman al-Zawahiri was hiding in Bajor and had taken a wife there. In January 2006, a drone supposedly targeting him landed on a village called Damadola, destroying 3 houses and killing 18 people. The Americans said he had been tipped off and escaped. That same year, on October 30, another U.S. Predator hit a madrasa on a hill near the main town of Kar, killing 82 people, many of them young boys. The Americans said it was the Al-Qaeda training camp which had featured in the group's videos and that the hill was riddled with tunnels and gun emplacements. Within a few hours of the attack, an influential local cleric called Fakir Mohammed, who had run the madrasa, announced that the deaths would be avenged by suicide bombings against Pakistani soldiers. My father and his friends were worried and called together local elders and leaders for a peace conference. It was a bitterly cold night in January, but 150 people gathered. "It's coming here," my father warned. "The fire is reaching the valley. Let's put out the flames of militancy before they reach here." But no one would listen. Some people even laughed, including a local political leader sitting in the front row. "Mr. Khan," my father said to him, "you know what happened to the people of Afghanistan. They are now refugees and they're living with us. The same is happening with Bajor. The same will happen to us, mark my words, and we will have no shelter, no place to migrate to. But the expression on the man's face was mocking. Look at this man, he seemed to be saying of my father. I am a Khan. Who would dare kick me out of this area? My father came home frustrated. I have a school, but I am neither a Khan nor a political leader. I have no platform, he said. I am only one small man. 8. The autumn of the earthquake. One fine October day when I was still in primary school, our desks started to tremble and shake. Our classes were still mixed at that age, and all the boys and girls yelled, "Earthquake!" We ran outside as we had been taught to do. All the children gathered around our teachers as chicks swarm to a mother hen. Swat lies on a geological fault line and we often had earthquakes, but this felt different. All the buildings around us seemed to be shaking and the rumbling didn't stop. Most of us were crying and our teachers were praying. Miss Ruby, one of my favorite teachers, told us to stop crying and to stay calm, it would soon be over. Once the shaking had stopped, we were all sent home. We found our mother sitting in a chair holding the Quran, reciting verses over and over. Whenever there is trouble, people pray a lot. She was relieved to see us and hugged us, tears streaming down her face. But the aftershocks kept coming all afternoon, so we remained very scared. We had moved again, we would move 7 times by the time I was 13, and were living in an apartment building. It was high for Mingora, 2 stories with a big water tank on the roof. My mother was terrified it would collapse on top of us, so we kept going outside. My father did not get home till late that evening as he had been busy checking all the other school buildings. When nightfall came, there were still tremors and my mother was in a state of panic. Every time we felt a tremor we thought it was the day of judgment. We will be buried in our beds, she cried. She insisted we leave, but my father was exhausted and we Muslims believe our fate is written by God. So he put me and my brothers Kushal and Atal, then just a baby, to bed. Go wherever you want, he told my mother and cousin. I am staying here. If you believe in God you will stay here. I think when there is a great disaster or our lives are in danger we remember our sins and wonder how we will meet God and whether we will be forgiven. But God has also given us the power to forget, so that when the tragedy is over we carry on as normal. I trusted in my father's faith, but I also shared my mother's very real concerns. That earthquake of October 8, 2005 turned out to be one of the worst in history. It was 7.6 on the Richter scale and was felt as far away as Kabul and Delhi. Our town of Mingora was largely spared, just a few buildings collapsed, but neighboring Kashmir and the northern areas of Pakistan were devastated. Even in Islamabad buildings collapsed. It took a while for us to realize how bad it was. When the TV news began to show the devastation we saw that entire villages had been turned to dust. Landslides blocked access to the worst affected parts and all the phones and power lines were down. The earthquake had affected 30,000 square kilometers, an area as big as the American state of Connecticut. The numbers were unbelievable. More than 73,000 people had been killed and 128,000 injured, many of them permanently disabled. Around 3.5 million people had lost their homes. Roads, bridges, water, and power had all gone. Places we had visited like Balakot were almost completely destroyed. Many of those killed were children who like me had been at school that morning. Some 6,400 schools were turned to rubble and 18,000 children lost their lives. We remembered how scared we had been that morning and started raising money at school. Everyone brought what they could. My father went to everybody he knew, asking for donations of food, clothing, and money, and I helped my mother collect blankets. My father raised money from the SWAT Association of Private Schools and the Global Peace Council to add to what we had collected at school. The total came to more than 1 million rupees. A publishing company in Lahore which supplied our school books sent 5 trucks of food and other essentials. We were terribly worried about our family in Shangla, jammed between those narrow mountains. Finally we got news from a cousin. In my father's small village 8 people had been killed and many homes destroyed. One of them was the house of the local cleric, MALALA, which fell down crushing his 4 beautiful daughters. I wanted to go to Shangla with my father and the trucks, but he told me it would be too dangerous. When he returned a few days later he was ashen. He told us that the last part of the journey had been very difficult. Much of the road had collapsed into the river and large boulders had fallen and blocked the way. Our family and friends said they had thought it was the end of the world. They described the roar of rocks sliding down hills and everyone running out of their houses reciting the Quran, the screams as roofs crashed down and the howls of the buffaloes and goats. As the tremors continued, they had spent the entire day outdoors and then the night too, huddling together for warmth, even though it was bitterly cold in the mountains. To start with, the only rescue workers who came were a few from a locally based foreign aid agency and volunteers from the Tehrik-Nafaz-e Sharia-e Mohammadi, TNSM, or Movement for the Enforcement of Islamic Law, the group founded by Sufi Muhammad that had sent men to fight in Afghanistan. Sufi Muhammad had been in jail since 2002 when Musharraf arrested a number of militant leaders after American pressure, but his organization still continued and was being run by his son-in-law Maulana Fazlullah. It was hard for the authorities to reach places like Shangla because most of the roads and bridges had gone and local government had been wiped out throughout the region. We saw an official from the United Nations say on television that it was the worst logistical nightmare that the UN had ever faced. General Musharraf called it a test of the nation and announced that the army had set up Operation Lifeline. Our army likes giving their operations names. There were lots of pictures on the news of army helicopters laden with supplies and tents, but in many of the small valleys the helicopters could not land and the aid packages they dropped often rolled down slopes into rivers. In some places, when the helicopters flew in, the locals all rushed underneath them, which meant they could not drop supplies safely. But some aid did get in. The Americans were quick as they had thousands of troops and hundreds of helicopters in Afghanistan, so could easily fly in supplies and show they were helping us in our hour of need, though some crews covered the American markings on their helicopters, fearing attack. For many in the remote areas it was the first time they had seen a foreigner. Most of the volunteers came from Islamic charities or organizations, but some of these were fronts for militant groups. The most visible of all was Jamaat Dawa, Judd, the welfare wing of Lashkar-e-Taiba. LET had close links to the ISI and was set up to liberate Kashmir, which we believe should be part of Pakistan, not India, as its population is mostly Muslim. The leader of LET is a fiery professor from Lahore called Hafiz Saeed, who is often on television calling on people to attack India. When the earthquake happened and our government did little to help, Judd set up relief camps patrolled by men with Kalashnikovs and walkie-talkies. Everyone knew these men belonged to LET, and soon their black and white banners with crossed swords were flying everywhere in the mountains and valleys. In the town of Muzaffarabad in Azad Kashmir, the Judd even set up a large field hospital with X-ray machines, an operating theater, a well-stocked pharmacy and a dental department. Doctors and surgeons offered their services along with thousands of young volunteers. Earthquake victims praised the activists who had trudged up and down mountains and through shattered valleys carrying medical help to remote regions no one else had bothered with. They helped clear and rebuild destroyed villages as well as leading prayers and burying bodies. Even today, when most of the foreign aid agencies have gone, shattered buildings still line the roadside and people are still waiting for compensation from the government to build new houses. The Judd banners and helpers are still present. My cousin who was studying in the UK said they raised lots of money from Pakistanis living there. People later said that some of this money had been diverted to finance a plot to bomb planes traveling from Britain to the US. With such a large number of people killed, there were many children orphaned, 11,000 of them. In our culture, orphans are usually taken in by the extended family, but the earthquake was so bad that entire families had been wiped out or lost everything, so were in no position to take in children. The government promised they would all be looked after by the state, but that felt as empty as most government promises. My father heard that many of the boys were taken in by the Judd and housed in their madrasas. In Pakistan, madrasas are a kind of welfare system as they give free food and lodging, but their teaching does not follow a normal curriculum. The boys learn the Quran by heart, rocking back and forth as they recite. They learn that there is no such thing as science or literature, that dinosaurs never existed and that man never went to the moon. The whole nation was in shock for a long time after the earthquake. Already so unlucky with our politicians and military dictators, now, on top of everything else, we had to deal with a natural disaster. Mullahs from the TNSM preached that the earthquake was a warning from God. If we did not mend our ways and introduce Shariat or Islamic law, they shouted in their thundering voices, more severe punishment would come. Part 2 The Valley of Death Rabab Manja Wakta Tir Shodai Kali Kwatate Libayan Ragali Dina Farewell Music. Even your sweetest tunes are best kept silent. The Taliban on the edge of the village have stilled all lips. 9 Radio Mullah I was 10 when the Taliban came to our valley. Maniba and I had been reading the Twilight books and longed to be vampires. It seemed to us that the Taliban arrived in the night just like vampires. They appeared in groups, armed with knives and Kalashnikovs, and first emerged in Upper Swat, in the hilly areas of Mata. They didn't call themselves Taliban to start with and didn't look like the Afghan Taliban we'd seen in pictures with their turbans and black-rimmed eyes. These were strange-looking men with long straggly hair and beards and camouflage vests over their shalwar kameez, which they wore with the trousers well above the ankle. They had jogging shoes or cheap plastic sandals on their feet, and sometimes stockings over their heads with holes for their eyes, and they blew their noses dirtily into the ends of their turbans. They wore black badges which said Shariat ya Shahadat, Sharia law or martyrdom, and sometimes black turbans, so people called them Torputki or the Black Turbaned Brigade. They looked so dark and dirty that my father's friend described them as people deprived of baths and barbers. Their leader was Maulana Fazlullah, a 28-year-old who used to operate the pulley chair to cross the Swat River and whose right leg dragged because of childhood polio. He had studied in the madrasa of Maulana Sufi Muhammad, the founder of the TNSM, and married his daughter. When Sufi Muhammad was imprisoned in a roundup of militant leaders in 2002, Fazlullah had taken over the movement's leadership. It was shortly before the earthquake that Fazlullah had appeared in Imamduri, a small village just a few miles outside Mingora on the other side of the Swat River, and set up his illegal radio station. In our valley we received most of our information from the radio because so many had no TV or are illiterate. Soon everyone seemed to be talking about the radio station. It became known as Mullah FM and Fazlullah as the Radio Mullah. It broadcast every night from 8 to 10 and again in the morning from 7 to 9. In the beginning Fazlullah was very wise. He introduced himself as an Islamic reformer and an interpreter of the Quran. My mother is very devout, and to start with she liked Fazlullah. He used his station to encourage people to adopt good habits and abandon practices he said were bad. He said men should keep their beards but give up smoking and using the tobacco they liked to chew. He said people should stop using heroin, and chars, which is our word for hashish. He told people the correct way to do their ablutions for prayers, which body part to wash first. He even told people how they should wash their private parts. Sometimes his voice was reasonable, like when adults are trying to persuade you to do something you don't want to, and sometimes it was scary and full of fire. Often he would weep as he spoke of his love for Islam. Usually he spoke for a while, then his deputy Shah Duran came on air, a man who used to sell snacks from a tricycle in the bazaar. They warned people to stop listening to music, watching movies, and dancing. Sinful acts like these had caused the earthquake, Fazlullah thundered, and if people didn't stop they would again invite the wrath of God. Mullahs often misinterpret the Quran and Hadith when they teach them in our country as few people understand the original Arabic. Fazlullah exploited this ignorance. Is he right, Abba? I asked my father. I remembered how frightening the earthquake had been. No, Yani, he replied. He is just fooling people. My father said the radio station was the talk of the staff room. By then our schools had about 70 teachers, around 40 men and 30 women. Some of the teachers were anti-Fazlullah but many supported him. People thought that he was a good interpreter of the Holy Quran and admired his charisma. They liked his talk of bringing back Islamic law as everyone was frustrated with the Pakistani justice system, which had replaced ours when we were merged into the country. Cases such as land disputes, common in our area, which used to be resolved quickly now took 10 years to come to court. Everyone wanted to see the back of the corrupt government officials sent into the valley. It was almost as if they thought Fazlullah would recreate our old princely state from the time of the Wali. Within 6 months people were getting rid of their TVs, DVDs, and CDs. Fazlullah's men collected them into huge heaps on the streets and set them on fire, creating clouds of thick black smoke that reached high into the sky. Hundreds of CD and DVD shops closed voluntarily and their owners were paid compensation by the Taliban. My brothers and I were worried as we loved our TV, but my father reassured us that we were not getting rid of it. To be safe we moved it into a cupboard and watched it with the volume low. The Taliban were known to listen at people's doors then force their way in, take the TVs and smash them to pieces on the street. Fazlullah hated the Bollywood movies we so loved, which he denounced as un-Islamic. Only the radio was allowed, and all music except for Taliban songs was declared haram. One day my father went to visit a friend in hospital and found lots of patients listening to cassettes of Fazlullah's sermons. "You must meet Maulana Fazlullah," people told him. "He's a great scholar. He's actually a high school dropout whose real name isn't even Fazlullah," my father retorted, but they wouldn't listen. My father became depressed because people had begun to embrace Fazlullah's words and his religious romanticism. "It's ridiculous," my father would say, "that this so-called scholar is spreading ignorance." Fazlullah was particularly popular in remote areas where people remembered how TNSM volunteers had helped during the earthquake when the government was nowhere to be seen. On some mosques they set up speakers connected to radios so his broadcasts could be heard by everyone in the village and in the fields. The most popular part of his show came every evening when he would read out people's names. He'd say, "Mr. So-and-so was smoking chars but has stopped because it's sinful," or, "Mr. X has kept his beard and I congratulate him," or, "Mr. Y voluntarily closed down his CD shop." He told them they would have their reward in the hereafter. People liked to hear their names on the radio. They also liked to hear which of their neighbors were sinful so they could gossip. "Have you heard about so-and-so?" Mullah FM made jokes about the army. Fazlullah denounced Pakistani government officials as infidels and said they were opposed to bringing in Sharia law. He said that if they did not implement it, his men would enforce it and tear them to pieces. One of his favorite subjects was the injustice of the feudal system of the Khans. Poor people were happy to see the Khans getting their comeuppance. They saw Fazlullah as a kind of Robin Hood and believed that when Fazlullah took over he would give the Khans land to the poor. Some of the Khans fled. My father was against Khanism but he said the Taliban were worse. My father's friend Hidayatullah had become a government official in Peshawar and warned us, "This is how these militants work. They want to win the hearts and minds of the people so they first see what the local problems are and target those responsible, and that way they get the support of the silent majority. That's what they did in Waziristan when they went after kidnappers and bandits. After, when they get power, they behave like the criminals they once hunted down." Fazlullah's broadcasts were often aimed at women. He must have known that many of our men were away from home, working in coal mines in the south or on building sites in the Gulf. Sometimes he would say, "Men, go outside now. I am talking to the women." Then he'd say, "Women are meant to fulfill their responsibilities in the home. Only in emergencies can they go outside, but then they must wear the veil." Sometimes his men would display the fancy clothes that they said they had taken from decadent women to shame them. My friends at school said their mothers listened to the radio mullah although our headmistress Madam Mariam told us not to. At home we only had my grandfather's old radio, which was broken, but my mother's friends all listened and told her what they heard. They praised Fazlullah and talked of his long hair, the way he rode a horse and behaved like the prophet. Women would tell him their dreams and he would pray for them. My mother enjoyed these stories, but my father was horrified. I was confused by Fazlullah's words. In the Holy Quran it is not written that men should go outside and women should work all day in the home. In our Islamic studies class at school we used to write essays entitled How the Prophet Lived. We learned that the first wife of the Prophet was a businesswoman called Khadijah. She was 15 years older than him, and she had been married before, yet he still married her. I also knew from watching my own mother that Pashtun women are very powerful and strong. Her mother, my grandmother, had looked after all 8 children alone after my grandfather had an accident and broke his pelvis and could not leave his bed for 8 years. A man goes out to work, he earns a wage, he comes back home, he eats, he sleeps. That's what he does. Our men think earning money and ordering around others is where power lies. They don't think power is in the hands of the woman who takes care of everyone all day long, and gives birth to their children. In our house my mother managed everything because my father was so busy. It was my mother who would wake up early in the morning, iron our school clothes, make our breakfast and teach us how to behave. It was my mother who would go to the market, shop for us and cook. All those things she did. In the first year of the Taliban I had 2 operations, one to take out my appendix and the other to remove my tonsils. Kushal had his appendix out too. It was my mother who took us to hospital, my father just visited us and brought ice cream. Yet my mother still believed it was written in the Quran that women should not go out and women should not talk to men other than relatives they cannot marry. My father would say to her, Pekai, Purda is not only in the veil, Purda is in the heart. Lots of women were so moved by what Fazlullah said that they gave him gold and money, particularly in poor villages or households where the husbands were working abroad. Tables were set up for the women to hand over their wedding bangles and necklaces and women queued up to do so or sent their sons. Some gave their life savings, believing that this would make God happy. He began building a vast red brick headquarters in Imamduri complete with a madrasa, a mosque, and walls and levees to protect it from the Swat River. No one knew where he got the cement and iron bars from, but the workforce was local. Every village had to take turns sending their men for a day to help build it. One day one of our Urdu teachers, Nawab Ali, told my father, I won't be coming to school tomorrow. When my father asked why, he explained it was his village's turn to work on Fazlullah's buildings. Your prime responsibility is to teach the students, replied my father. No, I have to do this, said Nawab Ali. My father came home fuming. If people volunteered in the same way to construct schools or roads or even clear the river of plastic wrappers, by God, Pakistan would become a paradise within a year, he said. The only charity they know is to give to mosque and madrasa. A few weeks later the same teacher told him that he could no longer teach girls as the Maulana doesn't like it. My father tried to change his mind. I agree that female teachers should educate girls, he said. But first we need to educate our girls so they can become teachers. One day Sufi Muhammad proclaimed from jail that there should be no education for women even at girls' madrasas. If someone can show any example in history where Islam allows a female madrasa, they can come and piss on my beard, he said. Then the radio mullah turned his attention to schools. He began speaking against school administrators and congratulating girls by name who left school. Miss So-and-so has stopped going to school and will go to heaven, he'd say, or, Miss X of Y village has stopped education at class 5. I congratulate her. Girls like me who still went to school he called buffaloes and sheep. My friends and I couldn't understand why it was so wrong. Why don't they want girls to go to school? I asked my father. They are scared of the pen, he replied. Then another teacher at our school, a maths teacher with long hair, also refused to teach girls. My father fired him, but some other teachers were worried and sent a delegation to his office. Sir, don't do this, they pleaded. These are bad days. Let him stay and we will cover for him. Every day it seemed a new edict came. Fazlullah closed beauty parlors and banned shaving, so there was no work for barbers. My father, who only has a mustache, insisted he would not grow a beard for the Taliban. The Taliban told women not to go to the bazaar. I didn't mind not going to the China bazaar. I didn't enjoy shopping, unlike my mother, who liked beautiful clothes even though we didn't have much money. My mother always told me, "Hide your face, people are looking at you." I would reply, "It doesn't matter. I'm also looking at them," and she'd get so cross. My mother and her friends were upset about not being able to go shopping, particularly in the days before the Eid holidays, when we beautify ourselves and go to the stalls lit up by fairy lights that sell bangles and henna. All of that stopped. The women would not be attacked if they went to the markets, but the Taliban would shout at them and threaten them until they stayed at home. One Talib could intimidate a whole village. We children were cross too. Normally there are new film releases for the holidays, but Fazlullah had closed the DVD shops. Around this time my mother also got tired of Fazlullah, especially when he began to preach against education and insist that those who went to school would also go to hell. Next Fazlullah began holding a shura, a kind of local court. People liked this as justice was speedy, unlike in Pakistani courts, where you could wait years and have to pay bribes to be heard. People began going to Fazlullah and his men to resolve grievances about anything from business matters to personal feuds. "I had a 30-year-old problem and it's been resolved in one go," one man told my father. The punishments decreed by Fazlullah's shura included public whippings, which we had never seen before. One of my father's friends told him he had seen 3 men publicly flogged after the shura had found them guilty of involvement in the abduction of 2 women. A stage was set up near Fazlullah's center, and after going to hear him give Friday prayers, hundreds of people gathered to watch the floggings, shouting Allahu Akbar. God is great, with each lash. Sometimes Fazlullah appeared galloping in on a black horse. His men stopped health workers giving polio drops, saying the vaccinations were an American plot to make Muslim women infertile so that the people of Swat would die out. To cure a disease before its onset is not in accordance with Sharia law, said Fazlullah on the radio. You will not find a single child to drink a drop of the vaccine anywhere in Swat. Fazlullah's men patrolled the streets looking for offenders against his decrees, just like the Taliban morality police we had heard about in Afghanistan. They set up volunteer traffic police called Falcon Commandos, who drove through the streets with machine guns mounted on top of their pickup trucks. Some people were happy. One day my father ran into his bank manager. "One good thing Fazlullah is doing is banning ladies and girls from going to the China bazaar, which saves us men money," he said. Few spoke out. My father complained that most people were like our local barber, who one day grumbled to my father that he had only 80 rupees in his till, less than a tenth of what his takings used to be. Just the day before, the barber had told a journalist that the Taliban were good Muslims. After Mullah FM had been on air for about a year, Fazlullah became more aggressive. His brother Maulana Liaquat, along with 3 of Liaquat's sons, were among those killed in an American drone attack on the madrasa in Bajor at the end of October 2006. 80 people were killed, including boys as young as 12, some of whom had come from Swat. We were all horrified by the attack and people swore revenge. 10 days later, a suicide bomber blew himself up in the army barracks at Dargai, on the way from Islamabad to Swat, and killed 42 Pakistani soldiers. At that time suicide bombings were rare in Pakistan, there were 6 in total that year, and it was the biggest attack that had ever been carried out by Pakistani militants. At Eid we usually sacrifice animals like goats or sheep. But Fazlullah said, on this Eid 2-legged animals will be sacrificed. We soon saw what he meant. His men began killing khans and political activists from secular and nationalist parties, especially the Awami National Party, ANP. In January 2007, a close friend of one of my father's friends was kidnapped in his village by 80 masked gunmen. His name was Malik Baidar. He was from a wealthy Khan family and the local vice president of the ANP. His body was found dumped in his family's ancestral graveyard. His legs and arms had all been broken. It was the first targeted killing in Swat, and people said it was because he had helped the army find Taliban hideouts. The authorities turned a blind eye. Our provincial government was still made up of mullah parties who wouldn't criticize anyone who claimed to be fighting for Islam. At first we thought we were safe in Mingora, the biggest town in Swat. But Fazlullah's headquarters were just a few miles away, and even though the Taliban were not near our house, they were in the markets, in the streets and the hills. Danger began to creep closer. During Eid we went to our family village as usual. I was in my cousin's car, and as we drove through a river where the road had been washed away, we had to stop at a Taliban checkpoint. I was in the back with my mother. My cousin quickly gave us his music cassettes to hide in our purses. The Taliban were dressed in black and carried Kalashnikovs. They told us, "Sisters, you are bringing shame. You must wear burqas." When we arrived back at school after Eid, we saw a letter taped to the gate. "Sir, the school you are running is Western and infidel," it said. "You teach girls and have a uniform that is un-Islamic. Stop this or you will be in trouble and your children will weep and cry for you." It was signed, Fadayin of Islam. My father decided to change the boys' uniform from shirt and trousers to shalwar kameez, baggy pajama-like trousers and a long shirt. Ours remained a royal blue shalwar kameez with a white dupatta or headscarf, and we were advised to keep our heads covered coming in and out of school. His friend Hidayatullah told him to stand firm. "Jiyauddin, you have charisma, you can speak up and organize against them," he said. "Life isn't just about taking in oxygen and giving out carbon dioxide. You can stay there accepting everything from the Taliban, or you can make a stand against them." My father told us what Hidayatullah had said. He then wrote a letter to the Daily Azadi, our local newspaper. "To the Fadayin of Islam or Islamic sacrificers, this is not the right way to implement Islam," he wrote. "Please don't harm my children because the God you believe in is the same God they pray to every day. You can take my life but please don't kill my school children." When my father saw the newspaper he was very unhappy. The letter had been buried on an inside page and the editor had published his name and the address of the school, which my father had not expected him to do. But lots of people called to congratulate him. "You have put the first stone in standing water," they said. "Now we will have the courage to speak." 10 toffees, tennis balls, and the Buddhas of Swat. First the Taliban took our music, then our Buddhas, then our history. One of our favorite things was going on school trips. We were lucky to live in a paradise like Swat with so many beautiful places to visit: waterfalls, lakes, the ski resort, the Vali's palace, the Buddha statues, the tomb of Akhund of Swat. All these places told our special story. We would talk about the trips for weeks beforehand, then, when the day finally came, we dressed up in our best clothes and piled into buses along with pots of chicken and rice for a picnic. Some of us had cameras and took photographs. At the end of the day my father would make us all take turns standing on a rock and tell stories about what we had seen. When Fazlullah came there were no more school trips. Girls were not supposed to be seen outside. The Taliban destroyed the Buddhist statues and stupas where we played, which had been there for thousands of years and were a part of our history from the time of the Kushan kings. They believed any statue or painting was haram, sinful and therefore prohibited. One black day they even dynamited the face of the Jahanabad Buddha, which was carved into a hillside just half an hour's drive from Mingora and towered 23 feet into the sky. Archaeologists say it was almost as important as the Buddhas of Bamiyan, which the Afghan Taliban blew up. It took them 2 goes to destroy it. The first time they drilled holes in the rock and filled them with dynamite, but that didn't work. A few weeks later, on October 8, 2007, they tried again. This time they obliterated the Buddha's face, which had watched over the valley since the 7th century. the Taliban became the enemy of fine arts, culture, and our history. The Swat Museum moved its collection away for safekeeping. They destroyed everything old and brought nothing new. The Taliban took over the Emerald Mountain with its mine and began selling the beautiful stones to buy their ugly weapons. They took money from the people who chopped down our precious trees for timber and then demanded more money to let their trucks pass. Their radio coverage spread across the valley and neighboring districts. Though we still had our television, they had switched off the cable channels. Maniba and I could no longer watch our favorite Bollywood shows like Shararat or Making Mischief. It seemed like the Taliban didn't want us to do anything. They even banned one of our favorite board games called Carom, in which we flick counters across a wooden board. We heard stories that the Taliban would hear children laughing and burst into the room and smash the boards. We felt like the Taliban saw us as little dolls to control, telling us what to do and how to dress. I thought if God wanted us to be like that, he wouldn't have made us all different. One day we found our teacher Miss Hamida in floods of tears. Her husband was a policeman in the small town of Mata, and Fazlullah's men had stormed in and some police officers had been killed, including her husband. It was the first Taliban attack on the police in our valley. Soon they had taken over many villages. The black and white flags of Fazlullah's TNSM started appearing on police stations. The militants would enter villages with megaphones and the police would flee. In a short time they had taken over 59 villages and set up their own parallel administrations. Policemen were so scared of being killed that they took out adverts in the newspapers to announce they had left the force. All this happened and nobody did a thing. It was as though everyone was in a trance. My father said people had been seduced by Fazlullah. Some joined his men, thinking they would have better lives. My father tried to counter their propaganda, but it was hard. I have no militants and no FM radio, he joked. He even dared to enter the radio mullah's own village one day to speak at a school. He crossed the river in one of the metal boxes suspended from a pulley that we use as makeshift bridges. On the way he saw smoke so high it touched the clouds, the blackest smoke he'd ever seen. At first he thought it might be a brick factory, but as he approached he saw bearded figures in turbans burning TVs and computers. In the school my father told the people, "I saw your villagers burning these things. Don't you realize the only ones who will profit are the companies in Japan, who will just make more?" Someone came up to him and whispered, "Don't speak any more in this way, it's risky." Meanwhile the authorities, like most people, did nothing. It felt as though the whole country was going mad. The rest of Pakistan was preoccupied with something else. The Taliban had moved right into the heart of our nation's capital, Islamabad. We saw pictures on the news of what people were calling the Burqa Brigade, young women and girls like us in burqas with sticks, attacking CD and DVD shops in bazaars in the center of Islamabad. The women were from Jamia Hafsa, the biggest female madrasa in our country and part of Lal Masjid, the Red Mosque in Islamabad. It was built in 1965 and got its name from its red walls. It's just a few blocks from Parliament and the headquarters of ISI, and many government officials and military used to pray there. The mosque has two madrasas, one for girls and one for boys, which had been used for years to recruit and train volunteers to fight in Afghanistan and Kashmir. It was run by two brothers, Abdul Aziz and Abdul Rashid, and had become a center for spreading propaganda about bin Laden, whom Abdul Rashid had met in Kandahar when visiting Mullah Omar. The brothers were famed for their fiery sermons and attracted thousands of worshippers, particularly after September 11. When President Musharraf agreed to help America in the war on terror, the mosque broke off its long links with the military and became a center of protest against the government. Abdul Rashid was even accused of being part of a plot to blow up Musharraf's convoy in Rawalpindi in December 2003. Investigators said the explosives used had been stored in Lal Masjid. But a few months later he was cleared. When Musharraf sent troops into the Fatah, starting with Waziristan in 2004, the brothers led a campaign declaring the military action un-Islamic. They had their own website and pirate FM station on which they broadcast, just like Fazlullah. Around the same time as our Taliban were emerging in Swat, the girls of the Red Mosque Madrasa began terrorizing the streets of Islamabad. They raided houses they claimed were being used as massage centers, they kidnapped women they said were prostitutes and closed down DVD shops, again making bonfires of CDs and DVDs. When it suits the Taliban, women can be vocal and visible. The head of the madrasa was Hassan, the wife of the elder brother, Abdul Aziz, and she even boasted that she had trained many of her girls to become suicide bombers. The mosque also set up its own courts to dispense Islamic justice, saying the state had failed. Their militants kidnapped policemen and ransacked government buildings. The Musharraf government didn't seem to know what to do. This was perhaps because the military had been so attached to the mosque. But by the middle of 2007 the situation was so bad that people began to worry the militants could take over the capital. It was almost unbelievable. Islamabad is usually a quiet, orderly place, very different to the rest of our country. Finally, on the evening of July 3, commandos with tanks and armored personnel carriers surrounded the mosque. They cut off the electricity in the area, and as dusk fell there was a sudden burst of gunfire and explosions. The troops blasted holes in the wall surrounding the mosque and fired mortars at the compound as helicopter gunships hovered overhead. Over loudspeakers they called for the girls to surrender. Many of the militants in the mosque had fought in Afghanistan or Kashmir. They barricaded themselves and the madrasa students inside concrete bunkers with sandbags. Worried parents gathered outside, calling their daughters on mobile phones, begging them to come out. Some of the girls refused, saying their teachers had taught them that to become a martyr is a glorious thing. The next evening a small group of girls emerged. Hidden among them was Abdul Aziz, disguised in a burqa, along with his daughter. But his wife and younger brother stayed inside, along with many students, and there were daily exchanges of gunfire between the militants and the troops outside. The militants had RPGs and petrol bombs made from Sprite bottles. The siege went on until late on July 9, when the commander of the special forces outside was killed by a sniper in one of the minarets. The military finally lost patience and stormed the compound. They called it Operation Silence, although it was very loud. Never had there been such a battle in the heart of our capital. Commandos fought from room to room for hours until they finally tracked Abdul Rashid and his followers to a basement where they killed him. By nightfall on July 10, when the siege was finally over, around 100 people had been killed, including several soldiers and a number of children. The news showed shocking pictures of the wreckage, everywhere blood and broken glass, and dead bodies. We all watched in horror. Some of the students at the two madrasas were from Swat. How could something like that happen in our capital city and in a mosque? A mosque is a sacred place for us. It was after the Red Mosque siege that the Swat Taliban changed. On July 12, which I remember because it was my birthday, Fazlullah gave a radio address that was quite different to his previous ones. He raged against the Lal Masjid attack and vowed to avenge the death of Abdul Rashid. Then he declared war on the Pakistani government. This was the start of real trouble. Fazlullah could now carry out his threats and mobilize support for his Taliban in the name of Lal Masjid. A few days later they attacked an army convoy traveling in the direction of Swat and killed 13 soldiers. The backlash wasn't just in Swat. There was an enormous protest by tribesmen in Bajor and a wave of suicide bombings across the country. There was one ray of hope: Benazir Bhutto was returning. The Americans were worried that their ally General Musharraf was too unpopular in Pakistan to be effective against the Taliban, so they had helped broker an unlikely power-sharing deal. The plan was that Musharraf would finally take off his uniform and be a civilian president, supported by Benazir's party. In return he would drop corruption charges against her and her husband and agree to hold elections, which everyone assumed would result in Benazir becoming prime minister. No Pakistani, including my father, thought this deal would work, as Musharraf and Benazir hated each other. Benazir had been in exile since I was 2 years old, but I had heard so much about her from my father and was very excited that she would return and we might have a woman leader once more. It was because of Benazir that girls like me could think of speaking out and becoming politicians. She was our role model. She symbolized the end of dictatorship and the beginning of democracy, as well as sending a message of hope and strength to the rest of the world. She was also our only political leader to speak out against the militants and even offered to help American troops hunt for bin Laden inside Pakistani borders. Some people obviously did not like that. On October 18, 2007, we were all glued to the TV as she walked down the steps of the plane in Karachi and wept as she stepped onto Pakistani soil after almost 9 years in exile. When she paraded on an open-top bus through the streets, hundreds of thousands of people flocked to see her. They had traveled from all over the country and many of them were carrying small children. Some released white doves, one of which flew to perch on Benazir's shoulder. The crowds were so large that the bus moved at a walking pace. We stopped watching after a while as it was clearly going to take hours. I had gone to bed when just before midnight the militants struck. Benazir's bus was blown up in a wave of orange flame. My father told me the news when I woke up the next morning. He and his friends were in such a state of shock that they had not gone to bed. Luckily, Benazir survived because she had gone downstairs to an armored compartment to rest her feet just before the explosions, but 150 people had been killed. It was the biggest bomb ever to have gone off in our country. Many of the dead were students who had made a human chain around the bus. They called themselves martyrs for Benazir. At school that day everyone was subdued, even those who had opposed Benazir. We were devastated but also thankful that she had survived. About a week later the army came to Swat, making lots of noise with their jeeps and helicopters. We were at school when the helicopters first arrived and were very excited. We ran outside and they threw toffees and tennis balls down to us, which we rushed to catch. Helicopters were a rare sight in Swat, but since our house was close to the local army headquarters they sometimes flew right over us. We used to hold competitions for who would collect the most toffees. One day a man from along the street came and told us that it had been announced in the mosques that there would be a curfew the next day. We didn't know what a curfew was and were anxious. There was a hole in the wall to our neighbor's house, Saifina's family, through which we used to communicate with them, and we knocked on the wall so they would come to the hole. "What does it mean, this curfew?" we asked. When they explained, we didn't even come out of our rooms because we thought something bad might happen.